The officer thought he was stopping an ordinary driver. He had no idea the man behind the wheel had spent a lifetime commanding people, protecting others, and carrying a story that would change everything. The morning sun stretched across a quiet highway in Virginia as General Elijah Brooks drove through the familiar roads near his home. There was nothing unusual about the vehicle. There was no military uniform, no official escort, no sign that the calm man behind the wheel had once stood in rooms where important decisions were made and thousands of lives were affected by his leadership. To anyone passing by, Elijah looked like any other driver beginning a normal day. But appearances often reveal only the smallest part of a person's story. Elijah had spent more than 35 years serving in the United States Army. Throughout his career, he learned that true leadership was not measured by attention, recognition, or titles. It was measured by responsibility, patience, and the ability to remain steady when situations became difficult. Even after reaching the highest levels of military service, he chose to live quietly. He valued conversations with his neighbors, time with his family, and the simple moments that reminded him why service mattered in the first place. That morning, he was not thinking about his rank. He was not thinking about his accomplishments. He was simply driving. Then the lights appeared behind him. Officer Jason Whitmore approached the vehicle with the confidence of someone who had spent years relying on his experience. He believed every traffic stop required attention, awareness, and control. Those qualities had helped him throughout his career as a police officer. But experience could sometimes create another challenge. It could make a person believe they already understood a situation before seeing the entire picture. Jason looked at Elijah through the window and saw only the moment in front of him. He saw a driver on the side of the road. He did not see decades of military service. He did not see the leadership lessons Elijah had carried throughout his life. He did not see the countless people who had trusted Elijah's decisions during his years in uniform. Elijah lowered the window and greeted the officer respectfully. "Good morning, officer. How can I help you?" His voice was calm. His attitude was cooperative. There was no frustration and no attempt to use his position to change the conversation. That surprised Jason slightly. He expected people to become defensive during situations like this, but Elijah remained patient. The general understood something that had guided him for decades. A person's character is often revealed in moments when they have every reason to react differently. As Jason continued the conversation, Elijah noticed something familiar. The officer was not only asking questions. He was forming an opinion. Elijah had seen this happen before. People often judged what they could see while missing the history they could not. But he also knew that truth did not need to be forced. It only needed time to appear. The highway continued moving around them. Cars passed by. People continued their daily routines without knowing that an ordinary traffic stop was becoming a moment that would challenge one man's assumptions and reveal another man's extraordinary journey. Because the quiet driver standing beside that Virginia road was not just another person waiting for a conversation to end. He was a leader whose greatest lesson was about to begin. Long before the morning traffic stop on that Virginia highway, General Elijah Brooks had already learned one of the most important lessons of leadership. The person standing quietly in front of you may be carrying a story you cannot see. That lesson was not learned from a single moment. It was built through decades of service, countless conversations, and years of understanding people from every background. Elijah never measured his life by the stars on his uniform or the titles attached to his name. He measured it by the trust people placed in him and the responsibility he carried when others depended on his decisions. As a young soldier, Elijah entered the United States Army with a simple belief. If someone wanted to lead others, they first had to learn how to listen. He remembered the early mornings, the long days of preparation, and the moments when he had to make decisions without having every answer immediately. Those experiences shaped the leader he would eventually become. Over the years, Elijah rose through the ranks because of his dedication, discipline, and ability to bring people together. But despite everything he achieved, he never allowed his position to separate him from others. He believed leadership was not about standing above people. It was about standing with them. After decades of service, Elijah chose a quieter life. He lived in a comfortable Virginia neighborhood where most people knew him simply as a kind neighbor. Some knew about his military background. Others only knew him as the person who offered thoughtful advice, greeted people with respect, and always made time for a conversation. He never introduced himself by his rank because he believed a title could describe a career, but it could not fully describe a person. That morning, as Officer Jason Whitmore continued the traffic stop, none of those details were visible. Jason did not know about the years Elijah spent serving his country. He did not know about the leadership decisions that shaped his career. He did not know about the people who had trusted him during some of the most important moments of his life. All Jason saw was the current situation, and that was exactly why Elijah remained patient. He understood that people often reacted to what they saw first. He had spent his military career teaching others to look deeper. A good leader did not make decisions based on incomplete information. A good leader searched for the full story. As the conversation continued on the roadside, Elijah quietly reflected on that principle. He was not angry. He was not looking for recognition. He simply hoped that the person speaking with him would take the time to understand before reaching a conclusion. Jason continued asking questions, believing he was doing what his responsibility required. He did not realize that the man answering him had spent a lifetime practicing the same values he believed he was protecting: fairness, discipline, and respect. The difference was that Elijah had learned those values through decades of leadership, while Jason was about to learn them through one unexpected encounter. Because sometimes the greatest lessons do not come from official meetings or important speeches. Sometimes they come from ordinary moments when one person decides whether they will judge quickly or take the time to truly understand. Officer Jason Whitmore had spent years believing that experience was one of the most valuable tools in his work. Every day on the road required attention, awareness, and the ability to make quick decisions. He believed that his instincts were built from countless encounters, and that those instincts helped him understand situations before they became complicated. But there was something experience could never replace: the importance of seeing the complete picture. Standing beside the Virginia highway, Jason continued his conversation with Elijah Brooks without knowing that this moment would challenge the way he viewed his own judgment. He looked at the situation through the lens of what was immediately visible: a driver, a traffic stop, a routine interaction. But every person involved in a moment like this carried a history that could not be seen in a few seconds. Elijah understood that better than most. During his years as an army leader, he had watched people make decisions based on incomplete information. He had seen how assumptions could influence opinions and how patience could create better outcomes. Those lessons were not only useful in military situations. They were lessons about humanity. As Jason asked more questions, Elijah continued responding respectfully. He provided the information requested and remained calm throughout the conversation. He did not try to change the direction of the interaction by explaining his military background. He did not mention the responsibilities he once carried or the people who had trusted his leadership. He simply allowed the process to continue. To Elijah, this was not about proving he was important. It was about showing that every person deserved to be treated with fairness before their story was known. Jason noticed something unusual about the man in front of him. Most people became impatient when they felt misunderstood. Some tried to control the conversation by explaining their position or demanding immediate recognition. Elijah did neither. He remained steady, almost as if he knew that the truth would eventually speak for itself. That calmness created a question in Jason's mind. Why was this person so comfortable with the situation? Why did he seem less concerned about proving himself than most people he had encountered? Jason looked again at the information he had received. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance, but something about Elijah's confidence and professionalism stood out. There was a level of discipline in the way he answered questions. It reminded Jason of people he had met who carried themselves with a sense of purpose. Yet he still did not know why. Elijah looked toward the road and thought about something his mentors had taught him many years earlier. A leader does not need to announce their achievements to be respected. A person's actions often reveal more than their words ever could. That belief had guided him through decades of service, and it continued guiding him now. The traffic around them continued moving. The morning continued as normal for everyone passing by. But beside that highway, two different perspectives were slowly coming together. One man believed he was handling a routine situation. The other man understood that the situation was becoming a lesson in patience, fairness, and understanding. And soon, a small detail would appear that would force Jason to look beyond what he thought he already knew. The morning continued along the Virginia highway, but the simple traffic stop was slowly becoming something far more meaningful. Officer Jason Whitmore remained focused on the information in front of him, trying to understand why the situation felt different from the many others he had handled throughout his career. He had followed the usual process. He had asked the necessary questions. He had reviewed the details available to him. Yet something about Elijah Brooks did not fit the assumption he had formed when he first approached the vehicle. Elijah remained calm, sitting patiently as the conversation continued. He understood that moments like this revealed more than just facts. They revealed character. During his years as a military leader, he had learned that pressure often showed who people truly were. Some people reacted quickly because they felt challenged. Others stayed steady because they understood the importance of patience. Elijah always believed that a calm response could reveal more than a loud argument ever could. Jason continued looking at the information provided by Elijah. The details seemed ordinary at first, but the way Elijah carried himself created a sense of curiosity. There was confidence without arrogance. There was respect without fear. There was patience without frustration. These qualities were familiar to Jason, but he could not explain why. He had met many people throughout his years as a police officer. He had seen people attempt to control conversations by mentioning their jobs, their connections, or their personal achievements. Elijah did not do any of those things. He never tried to make himself appear more important. In fact, he seemed determined to make the situation as simple as possible. That made Jason pause. The officer had expected someone who would argue or become defensive. Instead, he found someone who appeared completely comfortable allowing the facts to unfold naturally. Elijah noticed the hesitation in Jason's expression but chose not to interrupt the process. He knew that revealing his identity would immediately change the way the interaction was handled. But he also believed that respect should not depend on someone's title. A person should not have to reveal their achievements before receiving basic fairness. That belief had guided him throughout his entire career. A true leader did not ask others to treat them differently. A true leader showed others why fairness mattered. Jason stepped away briefly to review the information again. The highway continued around them, with vehicles passing and people continuing their daily routines. Nobody nearby understood the significance of the quiet conversation taking place beside the road. They only saw a police officer and a driver. They did not see the history behind the two people standing there. They did not see decades of service on one side or years of responsibility on the other. When Jason returned, his tone was slightly different. He was still professional, but the certainty from earlier had begun to disappear. He asked a few more questions, and Elijah answered with the same calm respect. Then, while reviewing the available information, Jason noticed a detail that caught his attention. Something about Elijah's record suggested a connection to a level of service far beyond an ordinary encounter. It was not enough to reveal the full story yet, but it was enough to create a question. Who exactly was the man standing in front of him? And why did his information seem connected to something much bigger than a simple traffic stop? For the first time that morning, Jason realized he might not be looking at the situation from the right perspective. And the answer was waiting somewhere inside the details he had not yet discovered. The small detail on the screen became the first sign that the traffic stop was not as simple as Officer Jason Whitmore originally believed. He looked at the information again, carefully reviewing what was in front of him. The name connected to the record seemed familiar, but he could not immediately understand why. It was not the type of information he expected to see during a normal traffic stop. Elijah Brooks remained quiet inside the vehicle, watching the officer process the details. He could sense that something had changed. The confidence Jason carried earlier had been replaced by curiosity and uncertainty. For the first time since the conversation began, the officer was no longer looking only at the situation in front of him. He was beginning to look deeper. Jason returned to the system and entered additional information for verification. The response was different from what he expected. Certain records required further confirmation through official channels. The message did not explain everything, but it suggested that the person connected to the information had a history that reached beyond ordinary public records. Jason paused. He had handled many situations during his career, but this was different. He was not trying to solve a problem anymore. He was trying to understand a person. Elijah had spent decades learning that important truths were often hidden beneath the surface. As a military leader, he had seen situations where the first impression was incomplete. He had taught others that assumptions could create mistakes if they were not challenged by facts. Now he found himself in a moment where those same principles were unfolding in front of him. He could have explained everything. He could have mentioned his position and ended the conversation immediately. But Elijah chose not to. He believed there was value in allowing people to discover the truth through the proper process. Respect that only appears after someone learns a person's title is different from respect given because every person deserves fairness. Jason looked back at Elijah with a different expression. The calmness of the man in front of him was becoming harder to ignore. Elijah was not acting like someone trying to avoid questions. He was not trying to use influence or connections. He was simply allowing the process to continue. That made Jason think about the difference between authority and leadership. Authority could come from a badge, a position, or a title. Leadership came from character. As the verification process continued, another message appeared. The information suggested that Elijah's record was connected to a senior military profile. Jason read it slowly, making sure he understood what he was seeing. The possibility seemed unexpected. The quiet driver on the side of the road might have a background far beyond anything Jason imagined. The highway remained busy around them. Vehicles continued passing. People continued their mornings without knowing that an important realization was taking place beside the road. Marcus remained patient because he knew the truth did not need to be forced. It only needed the opportunity to be recognized. Jason picked up his phone and prepared to contact the appropriate channel for confirmation. He still did not know the full story, but he now understood one thing clearly. The person he thought he understood at the beginning of the traffic stop was someone he had never truly seen. And soon, an official answer would reveal exactly who Elijah Brooks really was. The call for verification had been made, and for the first time that morning, Officer Jason Whitmore stepped away from the assumptions he carried when he first approached Elijah Brooks. He stood beside his patrol vehicle, waiting for an official response while looking back toward the quiet man sitting inside the car. The situation felt different now. It was no longer about a routine traffic stop. It was about understanding a person whose story was much larger than what appeared on the surface. Elijah remained calm, watching the road ahead. He had experienced moments of uncertainty before. Throughout his military career, there were times when answers did not arrive immediately and decisions required patience. He learned that the strongest leaders were not the ones who demanded immediate results. They were the ones who stayed focused while waiting for the truth. Jason checked his phone again as the verification process moved through official channels. The response time felt longer than expected, not because anything was wrong, but because the information required proper confirmation. Certain records connected to Elijah's identity were not ordinary public details. They belonged to a level of service that required additional authorization. Jason looked at the screen and began realizing that the situation he thought he understood was incomplete. He remembered the beginning of the conversation. He remembered how quickly he formed an opinion. He remembered believing he already knew what kind of interaction this would be. Now, those thoughts felt different. He started thinking about how many times people were judged by a single moment without anyone asking what came before it. Elijah had spent decades teaching others the importance of understanding the complete picture. A decision made without enough information could affect people in ways that could not be easily corrected. That principle applied everywhere, from military leadership to everyday life. Jason returned to the vehicle and spoke more carefully. The verification process is still ongoing, he explained. Elijah nodded. I understand. There was no frustration in his voice, no demand for special treatment. That response made Jason pause again. The officer expected someone with Elijah's background to immediately reveal his position. He expected a person with influence to use it. Instead, Elijah continued showing the same patience he had shown from the beginning. Jason began to understand that this was not simply humility. It was discipline. Elijah was allowing the system to work because he believed fairness should not depend on who someone was. It should depend on how people chose to act. A few minutes later, Jason's phone rang. The sound seemed unusually clear against the quiet background of the highway. He looked at the number before answering. It was connected to an official channel he did not normally receive calls from during routine situations. He answered professionally and listened carefully. At first, his expression remained focused. Then it slowly changed. The information coming through the phone confirmed that the person he had stopped was connected to a military history far beyond what he had imagined. Jason listened as the details were explained. He heard the name again. He heard the position. He heard the years of service connected to Elijah Brooks. The officer looked toward the vehicle, and for a moment he had no words. The man he had viewed as an ordinary driver was not ordinary at all. He was someone whose life had been defined by leadership, responsibility, and service. Elijah noticed the change but remained silent. He knew the moment was not about proving he was important. It was about allowing the truth to be recognized. And as Jason ended the call, the entire meaning of the traffic stop had changed forever. The silence after the official call felt different. Officer Jason Whitmore stood beside his patrol vehicle, holding the phone in his hand while the reality of the situation settled in. The information he had just received changed the way he looked at everything that had happened during the traffic stop. The man sitting quietly inside the vehicle was not simply someone with an unusual record. He was General Elijah Brooks, a respected Army leader whose decades of service represented commitment, responsibility, and dedication to the country. Jason looked back toward the vehicle and thought about the first few minutes of their interaction. He remembered the confidence he carried when he first approached. He remembered how quickly he believed he understood the situation. Now he realized how much he had not seen. Elijah noticed the change in Jason's expression but remained calm. He had never measured people by their mistakes. During his years as a leader, he learned that the most important moments were often the ones when people had the opportunity to recognize something they had missed. Jason approached the vehicle again, but this time his tone was different. The certainty from earlier had been replaced by respect and careful consideration. "General Brooks," he said, acknowledging the identity that had finally been confirmed. Elijah simply nodded. There was no pride in his reaction and no desire to make the officer feel uncomfortable. He understood that a title could explain a person's position, but it could never fully explain their character. Jason looked at Elijah with a new perspective. He thought about the fact that the general had never mentioned his rank. He had never attempted to end the conversation by using his influence. He had allowed the process to continue from beginning to end. That detail stayed with Jason because it revealed something important about Elijah's leadership. The general did not need recognition to know his own value. He did not need authority to demand respect. His actions had already shown who he was. "I have to admit, I did not expect this," Jason said honestly. Elijah looked at him calmly. "Most people do not know someone's entire story when they first meet them," he replied. The words were simple, but they carried the experience of a man who had spent a lifetime learning about people. Jason thought about how easily a person could be reduced to a single moment. A stranger on the road, a name on a document, a quick assumption based on limited information. But Elijah represented something much greater. He represented a lifetime of service that could not be understood. In a few minutes, the highway continued moving around them. Cars passed by, and the ordinary sounds of the morning continued. Yet the meaning of the encounter had completely changed. Jason was no longer speaking to someone he believed he understood. He was speaking to someone whose life had been shaped by leadership, sacrifice, and responsibility. Elijah did not use this moment to create embarrassment or demand an apology. Instead, he used it as an opportunity to share a lesson he had carried throughout his career. Respect should not begin after someone reveals their achievements. It should begin because every person deserves to be treated with fairness. For Jason, that message was more powerful than any official confirmation could have been. Because the greatest lesson of that morning was not about a military title. It was about the importance of seeing the person before seeing the circumstances around them. The highway remained busy as the morning continued, but for Officer Jason Whitmore, the moment beside the road felt completely different from when it began. The traffic stop had started as a routine responsibility, but it had become a lesson that would stay with him long after the vehicles around him disappeared into the distance. Jason stood quietly, thinking about everything that had happened. He thought about how quickly he had formed an opinion. He thought about how easily a person could believe they understood a situation without knowing the complete story behind it. General Elijah Brooks had not changed during the encounter. He had remained the same person from the first moment they spoke until the truth was revealed. Calm, respectful, patient. The only thing that changed was the way Jason saw him. That realization was important because it showed Jason that the difference was never in Elijah's actions. The difference was in the assumptions made before those actions were fully understood. Elijah had spent decades learning that leadership was not about having the ability to control every situation. It was about having the wisdom to respond in the right way. Throughout his military career, he had seen people become defined by moments when they were under pressure. Some allowed frustration to guide them. Others allowed patience to guide them. He always believed the second choice created stronger leaders and better communities. Jason looked back at the conversation and recognized something that stood out more than Elijah's rank. The general had never tried to make himself appear important. He had never used his achievements as a reason to receive different treatment. He had simply expected the same basic fairness that every person deserved. That was the part Jason found most meaningful. A person with decades of service and a lifetime of accomplishments had shown more patience than many people he had encountered in ordinary situations. Elijah noticed that Jason was reflecting on the experience. He did not need to explain every lesson. Sometimes a person learned the most when they reached the conclusion themselves. Everyone has a story that cannot be seen immediately, Elijah said. The challenge is remembering that before making a decision about someone. Jason listened carefully. Those words connected with something he had been thinking about since the verification call. His role gave him responsibility and authority, but it also required awareness. A badge represented a duty to serve people, not simply to evaluate them. A position carried expectations beyond the power attached to it. The conversation between the two men became less about the traffic stop and more about the values behind it. They spoke about responsibility, trust, and the importance of treating others with dignity. Elijah explained that throughout his years in the army, he learned that respect was not something reserved for certain people. It was something everyone deserved from the beginning. As the moment came to an end, Jason thanked Elijah for his patience. The general accepted the words with a simple nod. He did not see the encounter as a victory. He saw it as another reminder of why understanding mattered. Elijah returned to his vehicle and prepared to continue his journey. Jason watched him leave, carrying a different perspective than the one he had at the beginning of the morning. The road looked the same. The surroundings had not changed, but something inside Jason had changed. He now understood that true leadership was not always found in the person with the most visible authority. Sometimes it was found in the person who had every reason to demand recognition, yet chose instead to respond with dignity. The Virginia highway slowly returned to its normal rhythm after the unusual encounter between General Elijah Brooks and Officer Jason Whitmore. The vehicles continued passing, the morning continued moving forward, and most people who drove by would never know that a simple traffic stop had become a powerful reminder about judgment, respect, and the stories hidden behind every person. For Elijah, the moment was already becoming another quiet lesson in a lifetime filled with them. He had never searched for recognition. He had never needed strangers to know his accomplishments before understanding his character. After decades of service in the United States Army, he had learned that the strongest form of leadership was not found in attention or praise. It was found in the way a person treated others when there was nothing to gain. As he continued his journey, Elijah carried the same values that guided him throughout his career: patience, discipline, respect. Those qualities had helped him lead others through important moments, and they continued to guide him during ordinary moments like the one on that Virginia road. He understood that people sometimes made decisions based on limited information. He understood that first impressions could be powerful. But he also understood that first impressions were not always the truth. For Officer Jason Whitmore, the encounter became a moment of personal reflection. He returned to his daily responsibilities with a different perspective. The traffic stop had reminded him that authority was not only about having the ability to ask questions or enforce rules. Authority came with the responsibility to understand the people behind each situation. Jason thought about the beginning of the morning. He remembered seeing only a driver. He remembered believing he already understood what was happening. But now he understood that every person carried a history that could not be discovered in a few seconds. The lesson was not about one person being more important than another. It was about recognizing that every person deserved to be approached with fairness and respect. The story of General Elijah Brooks was not powerful because of his title alone. It was powerful because of the character behind the title. Even after his years of service, even after reaching a respected position, he remained someone who believed humility mattered more than recognition. He showed that true leadership was not about making others feel small. It was about making others understand something greater. Days passed after the encounter, but the lesson remained. Jason continued his work with a deeper awareness of the responsibility that came with his badge. He understood that every interaction was an opportunity to represent fairness and professionalism. And somewhere on another road, another person might one day be judged by a single moment, just as Elijah had been. But the hope was that people would remember the lesson from that morning. A person is always more than what appears in front of you. A name, a position, or an appearance can never tell the complete story. The most meaningful truths often exist beneath the surface, waiting for someone to take the time to discover them. General Elijah Brooks did not leave that highway looking for a victory. He left knowing that dignity had spoken louder than any title ever could. And Officer Jason Whitmore left with a lesson that would remain with him. A badge may represent authority, but true honor is revealed through the way that authority is used.